welcome. Good morning, this second day of the Global Energy Forum. I would like to thank again the Center for International and Regional Studies and the Energy Humanities Initiative for inviting us here. Trish, Hiwaraat, Vicky, somewhere I think. And I would like to welcome our guest. It's actually today an artist talk, but it's a historian talk, I could say, who happens to perform for Search of Power installation. So I would like first to introduce you, Ziad Abu-Rish, and then we will have some questions in relation to the installation that you can still see. It's in the self-guided tour at the Company House Annex the whole day today. So Ziad Abu-Rish holds a PhD in history from the University of California, Los Angeles, and he is currently completing a book project on the state of Lebanon popular politics and institution building in the wake of independence. He's actually the director of the MA program in human rights and the arts in Barth College, where Tanya El-Khoury is the director of the Center for Human Rights and Arts. And Ziad is also an associate professor of human rights and Middle Eastern studies at Barth College as well. Ziad's research centers around state formation, economic development, and popular mobilizations, particularly in Lebanon and Jordan. He is the co-editor of The Dawn of the Arab Uprisings in 2012, Critical Voices, a collection of interviews from and on the Middle East, 2015, and What is Political Economy, 2016. And of course, he's the author of multiple articles appearing in Middle East Report and Review of Middle East Studies, and several chapters in edited volumes on the political economy of the Middle East and the Arab uprisings. And actually, he's also a member of the board of directors of the Middle East Studies Association, known as MESA. So it's a great pleasure to find Ziad here again in Doha after 4 years when I had the honor to host the Search for Power interactive live art installation in Athens in the Fast Forward Festival that I was curating at that time. And I'm glad to see the installation version of this performative piece that was also hosted in Sharjah last year during the Sharjah Biennial, and had a chance to see it at the vegetable market there as well, because I'm based in NYU, Abu Dhabi. So today we'll have, in this first discussion, 30 minutes more or less with several questions that I had for Ziad. And then we will look forward to hear from you, to have questions and comments in the last 15 or so minutes of the interaction. And just to let you know, to remind you that Ziad will intervene also following our discussion in the panel on democracy and energy that Trish Kajle will moderate. So I imagine you will speak more about your research there and on political economy. So today we'll focus a little bit more on your research within the frame of this performative installation, and just retrace also a little bit the genesis of this beautiful project. That was actually, it happened after an award that Tanya El-Khoury got from the anti-festival at Kuopio festival in Finland. So you had some money to do research together and travel in different continents and research many different archives. And actually, I would like to know how all started, perhaps briefly, the idea of making this research-based live art project on the history of electricity in Lebanon, which was, of course, a transnational history of electricity at the end of this project, and especially what does it mean to collaborate with someone who comes from a different field, which is not yours, and how did you manage to blur or even erase the boundaries between the typical division of labor in this kind of interdisciplinary projects, when most of the times we have the historian, the researcher, the scholar who is producing the content, and then the artist is the person who normally, disseminate and share this knowledge with a broader audience. So how did you work with Tanya, and how was your position during this long research project? Did you feel as a creative partner? So we'll be really eager to hear about this kind of process, which brings you back in 2017, 2018, because the project premiered in 2018.
Yeah. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, well, thank you, Katia, for that very kind introduction. And I don't think it was intentional that we be paired. I don't think people knew the background of hosting the Search for Power. So some great questions. Just to kind of contextualize, for those that don't know, the Search for Power began as an interactive live art performance when we began touring it in 2018, and then beginning with the Sharjah Biennale, we converted it into an installation. And it's a collaboration between, as we pitched the project, the artist Tanya Al-Khouri and her historian husband, myself. And it's an attempt to kind of understand the history of electricity in Lebanon, and particularly the frequent and increasingly frequent power outages in Lebanon, and understanding why it happened. The genesis of the project was Tanya's own art practice, which whether it's collaboratively through the group Dictaphone in Lebanon or her individual career, has done a lot of research-based art and a lot of interactive art and performance art based on research. So it just happened that when she won the Anti-Festival International Live Art Prize, it comes with a major commission. And at that point, we had already been talking about potentially collaborating on bringing together some of the research that I was doing with some of the directions she wanted to take the research, and potentially collaborate on a performance. So that was the beginning of the conversation. And as a historian who works on Lebanon, I've always been deeply impressed with Tanya and a number of other people in Lebanon who are not scholars by the formal definition, but I believe have put to shame a lot of scholars who work on Lebanon in the type of archival research, oral history, ethnographies that they have been able to produce as knowledge producers. So I really came to this project as not someone who thought I was the knowledge producer, but wanted to collaborate with people, and particularly Tanya, who I happen to be married to actually what I felt was expand the kind of knowledge I was producing in collaboration with her. It was a very collaborative project. We worked together both on the research aspect and on the production aspect. So we did all the archival trips together. We read through the documents together, we summarized them together, we decided what's going to go into the show and what's not going to go into the show together. Of course, that process was not necessarily easy because of the very different backgrounds we have. So for example, I had things I wanted to say or make sure were in the show when we had the conversation about how important is it to put it in the show, or what function is it going to serve in the installation or in the performance. We had to have a big conversation about that. It's not like, publishing an article where you just want to make sure you make all these points by the time you reach the end of the article. So I found, the question of what to include and not include a much more complex process in creating this work. And similarly, when it came to writing the script, doing the performance, it was a collaborative project in that sense, but it was also one in which I was completely out of my element, and still am, quite frankly. So it's very important. We're in an artist talk, but I think I'm the artist's husband, as I like to say. But yeah, so it was really challenging to, first of all, perform. So for example, I love lecturing in a classroom. I'm very comfortable with it, and I think those of you that have attended the installation or read the script know I bring this up, and I'm very comfortable going right now and giving you a history or talking to you about the politics of Lebanon right now, but to actually perform where you have to be quite intentional and stick to the script, so to speak, because you need the performance to end by a certain time. It's not like a classroom where if I don't finish my lecture today, I'll see you next week and I'll finish it off then. So these kinds of constraints were completely new to me in a very different way, and so they were very challenging to work with. But I think, and you guys can judge when you see the show, that we were successful in doing that.
Thank you, Ziad, for sharing this insight, and I think you are a great performer, and I really regret that this, you said that this is your last project. Let's see. So speaking about the audience, because audience it's really key in Tanya's research process and artistic practice. He speaks about the importance of interacting with audience and the political potential of the audience. So how was this process of engaging the audience, making them feeling, sensing the archive, not only reading documents, and also have this sense of entering an archive, just in a way reenacting the same, in a way, feeling that you had when you managed to access some previously inaccessible archives. So how the form of this project, the dinner and this interactive relationship with the audience became at the end part of the content, or influenced even the content?
Well, I mean, a big part of this is Tanya's own thinking about interactivity with the audience and the lack of a passive audience, and also the idea of audience embodying elements of the performance or of the research that you're talking about. So it was really important to think about all of these things. I mean, when you write a text as an academic, it's only your words on a piece of paper that you can interact with the audience with. But when you're doing a performance, you can think about the visuals, you can think about the scent, you could think about the texture, you could think about the bodily movements, the lighting, all of these things. So we did a lot of thinking about that in those elements. So there are elements of the installation and the performance that very much reproduce the archival experience for those of you that have been in archives. But there are also very, elements that are completely separate from that. So for example, in the performance, one of the frustrations of the audience is that they're unable to really read all the documents that they're being confronted with in that moment. But the purpose is not necessarily to have them read all the documents we read and reach the same conclusions. It is to give them a sense of how overwhelming the amount of documentation can be and the lack of familiarity with can be. So which documents went in and which documents didn't go in had to be a combination of giving them the aha moment when they read through them, but also giving them the moment of, whoa, this is a lot of information. It's going to take me a lot to process, which is exactly what our experience was doing the research, right? And the other element, of course, was to not just photocopy or, we actually worked with the designer to try and reproduce the color, the texture, the binding. Sometimes there's a staple, sometimes there's a needle, sometimes there's a paper clip. These were all part of the original documents that we were thinking about. And of course, it takes place on a table that mimics our wedding table, for reasons that if you see the installation, you'll understand why that was important to us. So it's bringing the kind of academic, nerdy thing, of archives and documents, but it's also bringing our own personal experiences. And it's a way to talk about, I think, the way that the question of electricity and the history of electricity really are implicated in our most intimate moments. And I think that is, that involved thinking a lot about both zooming in and zooming out simultaneously when we were doing the show.
But also the very framing of the performance, a dinner table and a moment of your wedding, actually, just bringing this intimate knowledge within the frame of the larger official narratives.
Yeah, and there is some, again, there is some weird parallelism between the wedding table and the archive table, and that's what we tried to play with in the show. Like when I took Tanya into the archives and we sat down, in some of the archives we went to, she was like, this could very well be a dinner table or a wedding table. And then that's kind of where the connection started to come.
Interesting. So let's speak a little bit about the title of this performative interactive installation, The Search for Power, and this relation between power and electricity. You retrace the connection of the colonial powers in the creation, expansion, and even destruction of the public utility infrastructure in Lebanon, and particularly electricity, and the connection with local elites and the corruption political system. Also, in the introduction of the book that you recently published, there is a new text where Tanya reflects on the recent 2019 uprising, when the National Electricity Company was targeted as one of the symbols of this corruption and the injustice perpetrated by the political class. Can you develop a little bit more this connection between politics and power in Lebanon?
Sure. I mean, the narrative of the performance and the installation, and indeed our own research, was to try and understand why are there power cuts. And for a long time, it felt like we were in search of a technical answer. So we were actually searching for the power or lack thereof source of power in terms of electricity. But the more we did research, and we had a hunch about this, but we didn't understand it fully until the research unfolded, we then understood that no, the power cuts are a result of a series of decisions that were made by those in power. And then it was a question of, okay, so who do you hold responsible for this state of affairs? And how do you try to track it down? So it kind of plays on those three levels of power as electricity, power as decision makers, but power as actual, like, economic and political or colonial elites in this story. Part of the story was already clear to me from my own research in the academic world, which really focuses on the 40s and 50s, when the electricity company was targeted as part of the anti-colonial movement, as part of the decolonial movement, as part of the call for a greater role for the state in providing to the citizens and to the population of Lebanon. But, you know, there was a whole prehistory to that and a post-history to that that was not clear at all. And of course, if we're talking about Lebanon, the civil war looms quite large in this story, right? Where the average person in Lebanon understands the problem of electricity as one that is specifically a function of the fact that there was a 15-year civil war, that we never properly built the country up afterwards, that there were repeated Israeli bombardments of electricity infrastructure as part of the bombardment of the country as a whole that was never really properly addressed. And those are two very important elements of the story, but that it would be an oversimplification to use that to explain why today we have power cuts in Lebanon.
Yeah, at the same time, as you said, you are working as a researcher on this, as you call it, Lebanon exceptionalism and the exclusion for the comparative political economy scholarship. And then you are, in your article, Lebanon Beyond Exceptionalism, you mention this connection of Lebanon with the Global South, and that what happened in Lebanon was not an isolated case. And this somehow reminds me also Frederick Mayton, Electrical Palestine, a book that my dear colleague Tricia brought to my attention during our workshop in Abu Dhabi at the beginning of this week, where there is, he discusses these mutual influences between technology and politics. He calls them this tension also techno-capitalism. So if you could share with us more insights regarding this connection of Lebanon with the global politics in the global South, and also what you discuss a lot in your article, but also it's an important part of the narrative, the dramaturgy of research, Search of Power installation regarding the connection after the Lebanon's independence, after 43, with capitals from all over the world, and also from this region, which were invested in Lebanese Lebanese banks. So I don't know if you can develop a little bit more this point, which is a key point in the dramaturgy of the piece, I think, itself, when Tanya speaks about that this is not at the end a discussion, a story about the electricity of Lebanon, but a transnational story about power.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I will point to three elements that are in the show, but also in what I would call the kind of comparative history of Lebanon, and that we played with. The first is that electricity comes to Lebanon, and specifically Beirut, in many of the same ways it comes to a lot of other parts of the global south, through a concessionary regime where local capitalists are partnering with foreign capitalists, usually Europeans, in thinking about kind of developmentalist projects, infrastructure projects that are really profit motivated and profit driven, but are part of the will to improve that local governments in the global south are implementing at this time. And Lebanon in this case is not exceptional. It's how electricity starts in different parts of the Middle East, like Iraq, like Palestine, with the concession there, and elsewhere in North Africa and elsewhere in the global south. So that's one element. The other element is the fact that electricity as an infrastructure is foreign owned and foreign controlled during colonialism and briefly after independence, makes it a major target of the broader anti-colonial movement in Lebanon. So yes, the electricity company is being targeted because it needs to provide better service, lower prices, more transparent governance, but it's also being targeted because it's foreign owned, and the continuation of foreign ownership is viewed as a form of incomplete independence, which is a story that we're very familiar with in the global south in terms of post-colonial attempts to regain control of major resources and major sectors of the economy and so on and so forth. So in that way, Lebanon is not exceptional. And the third element, I think, is what we would call the neoliberal turn, right, in Lebanon, and the question of neoliberalism and public utilities, which also is not unique to Lebanon. And what happens, it just so happens that post-war reconstruction in Lebanon coincides with the kind of neoliberal moment in much of the Middle East. And so the discussions then about whether Lebanon should privatize its electricity sector or not, and what level of privatization would be appropriate to revitalize it, is really important in the current moment. And this brings us back full circle in the installation performance, but also in our discussion, is that Lebanon electricity started as a privatized matter, right, through the concessionary regime. And the problems go back to then. And so now we're talking about the legacies of those problems through state-owned electricity, and the solution being provided is to privatize the electricity. But if we look at that longer history, we know that the question is not really about privatization, it's something else. And so we try to engage with that. I keep getting confused, should I look at you or look at the audience? It's very
Me too, but I try both.
Yeah.
There is no fourth wall, no? Let's, my last question just before opening the floor to the audience and perhaps have a kind of larger discussion, because I think that you are touching very important issues also in relation to yesterday's panels and the discussion that we had about infrastructure and this connection with the politics of power. I'm wondering, after, now it's has been several years that you are performing. Of course, we had the break during the pandemic, but now it's a kind of new phase where you are start to tour again with the performance. You will also present it in Lebanon.
We're hoping, yes.
For the first time, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is interesting to see how this narrative can relate with the local audience. So I'm wondering how this project, which is ongoing in a way, transformed you? How did you influence your research? I don't know, can we say that new narratives have been produced by this, through this interaction with the audience and audience in different spaces and places around the world? You discussed also at some point about this importance of public scholarship, which is a key notion in academia, I think. Now, how can we really disseminate our knowledge beyond, not only within the academic field? So how this ongoing, your ongoing interaction with the performance field had any kind of impact on your own academic research and help you perhaps transform or expand?
Yeah.
your research?
No, I think that's a great question. Prior to my collaboration with Tanya on this project, I had a broader commitment to public scholarship or public-facing scholarship, primarily in the form of a project myself and other people work on called Jadaliya, which is an electronic magazine that kind of hosts analysis on the Middle East. But moving into this domain was a very different dynamic because it allowed us to bring arguments and discussions into spaces that I was not necessarily accessing or engaging with. In terms of having, I think academics also share their work internationally and in different contexts, but I think the context of art festivals and performance festivals made it a very different question of public engagement. And for me, and this is what I try to say in my part of the introduction in the book, is it's a real challenge that most scholars that are having the discussion about public engagement are having it with themselves. They're not actually engaging with other knowledge producers that are publicly engaged, that are not scholars, to maybe learn a thing or two, right? Not all, but most. And that's my experience. So as more and more PhD programs are trying to think of how to retool the PhD program because there aren't enough academic jobs out there, they're just bringing in other academics to talk about that, right? They're not bringing in other researchers that are non-academic to think about what it means to do that, at least in a more systematic way. So it's been really interesting to think about that and to really think about sharing your research with an audience that is going to embody it in a particular way. And I think this is a big part of Tanya's work. If you think of Garden Speak, if you think of Cultural Exchange Rate, The Sea is Mine, many other pieces she's done. So for me, it was a real challenge to think about what does it mean to actually engage the audience of your research in an interactive way. On the other hand, there's a whole archival turn, which I don't need to tell anyone in this audience about, in the art world. And we're hoping that part of what this is also having a conversation about the archival turn in the art world. And what does it look like? What directions could it go? These kinds of things. So we're kind of playing with both how academics are thinking about public scholarship, but also how the art world is engaging with the archival turn on that front. In terms of research questions, just working on this has produced a number of other topics and themes that I think Tanya and I are thinking about separately and together, which we might try to pursue in our own research agendas, and we're very interested in that. But we really want to come back to this because, as you said, the pandemic kind of put a pause on being able to tour this work.
Can you share with us one of these new narratives that came out of this performative research project? Just to give us an example.
Yeah, I think there's something that happens in the Civil War where it's like every few months the promise of fixing electricity is made, and it's literally like in 4 months we'll fix the electricity, beginning in late 1975, right? And that goes on for about 7, 8, 9 years before it just stops. Right? And now, in the post-war moment, every government that comes to power is promising to fix electricity within 6 months or 9 months or whatever period. So there's something really interesting, I think, in the Civil War period, which when we look back at it, we think of it as a 15-year block of time that was experienced as a singular war or something like that. And there are people in this room that have said and written things far more sophisticated about the Lebanese Civil War than I'm going to say here. But this idea that when you actually look at it through the conversations on electricity, you realize that people living in a civil war don't know it's going to last 15 years. They really also think it's going to end in a few months. Or they think because there's a lull in the fighting that they can start talking about reconstruction. I mean, the discussion on reconstruction emerges at least 6 different times in that 15-year period. People really believed the war was over after the first 2 years. People really believed the war had reached a stalemate after 5 years. So, it's opening other questions that might not be related to electricity, but have to do with temporality, time, how people think about the Civil War, which is funny because my whole raison d'etre in doing my project is to get away from the Civil War, right? I think there's too much emphasis on the Civil War, and I was interested in something before.
But yeah, you're writing also about this militia economy that you're mentioning in your studies on political economy. And it's interesting because what you are saying shows us a little bit the interconnection between histories, but also spaces, but also times, that everything is interrelated in a way that we don't need to, we should not isolate historical periods, but just as you are trying in this performance, try to examine from multiple perspectives and points of view. So thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful discussion, Ziad. Thank you all.